Awesome. Now,
Okay,
are you in West
great.
Palm Beach, Renee?
My colleague Raquel is, and we've started our meeting here. So welcome everyone. Excited to have individuals joining us today. Lots of great people coming in. Still allowing people in from the lobby. So we'll give it a moment here.
Awesome.
Oh, perfect. Still some others joining. Welcome everyone. A big happy Wednesday. I don't know about all of you, but it's been a very busy week. I'm based in Philadelphia, and the sun is shining, the flowers are blooming, so it's been a joy to have some extra time outside.
Awesome.
Okay. Well, let's go ahead and jump right in. So, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Mastering Latin American Clinical Trials, Strategies for Successful Setup and Patient Engagement. My name is Renee Roberts. I'm a Senior Project Manager at Patient Wing, and I'll be your facilitator for today's session. We're thrilled to have each and every one of you joining us today. And as many of you know, Latin America continues to emerge as a strategic hub for clinical research. But with these opportunities also come with some unique challenges, whether it's navigating different country specific regulations or managing logistics or even ensuring culturally sensitive patient engagement. So today you'll hear from an expert in this area who will share some key insights, best practices, and also some real world strategies to help you design as well as run successful trials in LATAM. And before we begin, I'll just do a quick few housekeeping items at the top of our call. Please feel free to submit your questions in the Q&A box throughout today's presentation, and then we'll have some dedicated time towards the end to address those Q&As, and also maybe have some questions for you all as well. Today's session will be recorded, so you'll receive that link shortly after today's event. And with that, I would like to introduce today Sarah Tylowski, CEO of Farmacon Global, as our speaker. And as we kick off today, I want to share a brief bio for Sarah. She brings over 20 years of experience leading teams in both large as well as small pharmaceutical and biotech environments. She has led Farmacon Global, a strategic CRO of medical consultants, in accelerating clinical trials, increasing diversity, supporting enrollment, and paving the way to market access in emerging markets. Known for her high cultural intelligence and problem solving skills, Sarah and her team specialize in rare diseases, immunology, infectious diseases, cancer, and vaccines. And fluent in Spanish and living and having lived on 4 continents, she brings a special focus on Latin America while actively expanding into other key markets globally. She's directed, or her direction has played a pivotal role in steering Farmacon Global towards healthcare innovation and global market leadership. So, with that, Sarah, thank you so much for joining us today. I know that our audience is in for a treat, so I will pass over to you to kick us off.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Renee. Great intro, and we're excited to be here as part of Patient Wing. So, buenos dias, bon dia, buenas tardes, boa tarde. I'm very excited to be able to share a little bit of insight on the Latin American market for clinical trials specifically. And I just really appreciate you guys being here today and including your audience. So, thank you so much. And because I'll just ask you to do the slides as per our little technical thing there, that would be great. So why Latin America for enrollment? I mean, what's going on there? We know that there's diversity. If you look at the map here in the slide, Brazil, for example, is the second most diverse country next to the United States in the world. And I bet a lot of people didn't know that. And in fact, Brazil and Colombia, over 50% of their population has some kind of African gene in them. So a lot of companies that are looking to create that kind of diversity will go there. Of course, there's a lower competition for clinical trials. Less than 10% of all trials globally are taking place in Latin America. There's a great trust. The physician actually still counts in the region. And of course, the regulatory environment is changing. It's evolving, which is great. And I think a big message for especially the biotechs out there is that it is 30 to 50% lower cost than trials in Europe and the United States. And of course, we're in the similar time zone. So those are really big pluses as to why companies should come to Latin America. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit about the acceleration approach that we have taken. We've already talked about the diverse and often treatment naive patient population. We want to know, I think, let's see, can you, oh, sorry, it's my slide. And we want to also focus on the regional expertise and the site relationships that we have, as well as the fact that there are country level strategies that are different. There are 20 countries in Latin America. There are 660 million people. It's not just a one size fits all type of scenario. And partnering directly with these PIs, these principal investigators and sub-investigators, is really, really important, because in the culture, it is about the relationship, as we know, and in a clinical trial, even more important. So the early engagement in the next slide is important because that creates the motivation. It gets the assessment that one needs. So one of our methodology is to interview our PIs and sub-investigators early on. Once we get a site up and running, we like to talk to them one more time. Sometimes you have investigator meetings, and then later on that site's finally gotten activated. It may be months, it may be a longer time. And so they've forgotten about the protocol. They haven't forgotten, but they don't know what they need to know sometimes. So a refresher is often needed. And in terms of enrollment, having that discussion and finding out where the gaps are, identifying the barriers, and finding out which ones of those barriers we can overcome early in the game will really help drive the whole enrollment. Of course, the final piece is that you want to prioritize those sites that will help get regulatory pathways done early. And so you do prioritize those more high performing sites initially to get the whole system activated. And so what does that mean? So that means in the country level, again, you need an action plan that's extremely tailored, considering the local risks. I mean, for example, we know now that Mexico has slowed down a bit in their regulatory, although one can get a site usually up and running in 60 days. We know that Argentina has had a lot of inflation, and you have to consider that, although again, it's much more stabilized than it had been a few years ago. And so you need to take those tailored situations into consideration and be flexible about where to start first and why, et cetera. And then, of course, from a cultural point of view, forget doing anything mid-December to mid-January. Forget Mardi Gras, in Brazil. You're just not going to get action. And I honor those holidays for the Latin American culture and just need to be aware of that from a business perspective. So that's super important. And then in the next slide, and tell me if I'm going too fast, Renee, you'll have to slow me down if you want. But in the next slide, this is really important. In the United States and in Europe, referring doctors are almost an impossibility. There are sunshine laws in the US that really look down on the whole process. Everybody wants to get paid. It's a complex situation. And in Europe, it's even more complex. You can't even share anything. It's very, very difficult to talk to your colleagues about a potential clinical trial. So in Latin America, again, because the networks are very tight, because the doctors tend to know each other and they tend to go to their, specialty meetings, et cetera, you can really expand the reach beyond the PI site. And you do that by leveraging these relationships and getting these referrals because they care. They really care about their patients. What if you have a rare disease patient and you not even sure you had the diagnosis, and then you hear about a potential clinical trial for your patient? Well, wouldn't you want them to be in the clinical trial? At least find out what the options are. Or in cancer, same thing. These harder to treat trials that's very, very key. So what happens is you end up with a community of referrers, community of doctors and even sometimes nurses or even caregivers who are around the study site or geographically. If you look at a country like Brazil that has I think it's over 230 million people, it's a big country. It's geographically bigger than the United States. Or look at Mexico, it's about 130 million, also a fairly large country. So, you can go around the sites, but let's say you're dealing in hepatology. Well, there's not that many hepatologists in any of the countries. So you want to make sure you've opened up your network, you've opened up your region to find where those potential patients could lie. And so one of the methodologies that we have found that's been very successful in the region is to have face-to-face meetings. What an idea. We've gotten away from that. In conferences we see people, but we're on Zoom or Teams all the time now. That's what we do. So if you can launch a small face-to-face, whether it's lunch and learns, whether it's a round table within a hospital of a given specialty, and you can get into the doctor's face and share basic information that would be listed on clinicaltrials.gov, so would not need to have EC approval. It's a great way to launch that process. And then you can also have these, we'll talk about later, these enrollment best practice webinars as either a follow-up or as part of it, and then lots of follow-up, of course. This is why you do need people on the ground that know what they're doing, so it's important. So let's go to the next slide and let's talk a little bit more about these enrollment best practice training webinars. So the way it would work is you start with your principal investigator, your sub-investigators, get their buy-in. Obviously, the sponsor is extremely involved in terms of what data you want to share. Usually, the way we have found to be a good methodology is to just share public data. So there's not this EC approval, it doesn't take so long to get it approved, et cetera. And in collaboration with the sponsor, we make that presentation and we put it together. And we want to basically what we want to do is reinforce the messaging about the benefits to the referring doctors group, why that's important, what does that mean, what does a participant need in terms of logistics? As I said earlier, there could be some major travel if it's a rare patient or an oncology or any kind of other immunology type rare patient. They're going to need help. They're really going to need help. So you want to make sure you've got all that data available and a communication channel planned so that these referring doctors can actually pick up the phone and talk to somebody, whether it's a site coordinator, whether it's a recruitment specialist, whatever that might be, just to have somebody that's in the system that they can get some more contact. And then, of course, as mentioned earlier, and I can't emphasize this enough, a culturally adapted approach is really important. You might find out that, as I said earlier, people want to get together for coffee, and some sponsors, some bigger farmers are very, ixnay on having even a glass of water available for a referring group, like if it's a face-to-face. But you want to be able to adapt to the culture, and normally if you were to do a face-to-face, for example, you want to at least have, some kind of snack available just because that's culturally sensitive. In a webinar, you don't have to worry about that so much, but you also want to look at times. We've done many, many webinars that are 8 p.m. at night. That seems so late in the American culture, but it's not in the Latino culture. They're typically eating, 7, 8 p.m. So, or they're coming off work 5, 6, 7 p.m. So an 8 p.m. would make sense. Or on the flip side, maybe a 6 or 7 a.m. Webinar. So you have to be flexible to be able to get that thing rolling the way you want to get good attendance. So that's been a success tool that's worked for us. And then in the patient advocacy groups, with all these AI tools out there, we know they're out there, there's been a lot of data collection. And in Latin America, we're concerned about people's rights, patients' rights. It's really, really important. I can tell you that all the Latin American countries follow HIPAA guidelines, their own version, or GDPR, and they're very, very careful about patient data. One thing that people don't realize when I'm talking about patients in general is you cannot pay patients for their time to be in a clinical trial. This is something that's common practice in the United States. But what you can do is help pay for transportation, help pay for meals if they have to overnight, in a hotel to see their doctor, see their PI, et cetera. So the patient advocacy group, therefore, becomes very, very important. And having that trusted organization behind you is important. In Latin America, there are a number of informal patient advocacy groups. They don't have a fancy name or a nonprofit status. I mean, they're informal. And this is extremely true in these more rare conditions. And I remember a story about a situation where we were hired to bring in patients in from Mexico for a rare condition for Duchenne. And there was not a formal PAG group, but we knew those patients were out there. So we did a lot of digging. It wasn't easy, and we were able to locate a couple of groups. We brought them together just to have a conversation about the moms talking about their patients, et cetera, their kids, I should say. And I always remember very distinctly there was a mom there whose son had died 10 days prior, and yet she still wanted to be there and find out what's going on and how she can get her other son into a clinical trial. And as a result of this digging and creating trust with these moms mostly, we were able to bring in the last 15% into the trial, and then we know the rest is always good in a phase 3. The bottom line is you have to raise awareness about clinical trials among patients, caregivers. It's a big deal because, we know the guinea pig story. We won't revisit that one, but it's very true that there's a need for building trust, and the PAG methodology is a great way to do it. And of course, supporting that navigation of the patient. What do they need? We had one trial where the site needed a television so that his little kids who were coming for the trial could, just watch TV or watch, something, a little video before they went in to see the doctor to be distracted a little bit. And then he didn't have it. He just had a blank office. So we had to go find a TV for him. I mean, sometimes it's silly, simple stuff that's so important, that's very physical and very important. And of course, as we move into the digital world, that's changing as well. But that's important to support the trust always. Okay, next slide. So in this slide, I think I've really kind of honed in on this, but this cultural adaptation is really important. A small example, if you look at the word grapefruit, Renee and I talked about this the other day. The word for grapefruit is different like in Mexico, it's different than what it is toronja in some countries, and it's pomodoro in other countries. And of course, Brazil is Portuguese, so that's a whole nother layer. You have to be very aware that it's not one size fits all. You can't just Google Translate and have it. Of course, you have to have it certified. But the point is you really want to localize your ICFs and your data that you're sharing as far as recruitment materials. Adopt them to the local literacy. I cannot emphasize that enough. We know in the US that the level of knowledge for clinical trials is around 6th grade, 8th grade, more or less. It's changed a little bit, but it's very low still in Latin America, probably because less than 10% of the trials are taking place there. So it's very important to set the expectations of what patients are interested in hearing, and then check for understanding. It's super important in that whole cultural adaptation. And then of course, when you've put together your plan and you've got your outreach, the next slide, is to do that continuous monitoring and feedback. That's super important. What are your KPIs? What are you measuring right up front? Did those acceleration plans that you did with talking to the PI, did they work for you? What do you need to change? It's, as we all know, in recruitment and enrollment, it's an often changing story. It's not static, because sometimes enrollment goes longer. Sometimes there's an amendment in the protocol. It's endless. So you have to be tracking what you're doing and seeing what that performance looks like. Share the reports with your sponsors. Get feedback from the sites. Be honest with them. Be transparent. What's working, what's not working, because we all know people think they can do everything themselves, right? And in the culture, again, of Latin America, and this is something I've experienced, I had a dear friend who was 40 years old before he could say the word no. So culturally, the people will say yes, it's just what it is, and then of course adjust strategies accordingly. And let's see, next slide. I think the last thing I'd like to say is it's really important to understand that you have these 20 countries. The main countries that we're seeing a lot of clinical research is in the big countries like Brazil, Mexico, Argentina, Colombia. But you also have to realize that the data has extremely improved. There's been a criticism, and it's probably legitimate, that there's not good data. Well, the FDA accepts data from all those countries. They accept data from Central America, from Chile, Peru, all the ones I mentioned. And what's important is there are the patients sitting there waiting to get some treatment option. And that's probably why, there's a question mark on the data. The FDA can come and audit. We've helped do many audits. All the projects we've ever been on, we've all had clear audits. But those are important pieces to understand for especially for the biotechs that might be considering coming to Latin America. So that's my story. Thank you so much. And of course, with Patient Wing's digital outreach, I think we can We can be great partners.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah. And I want to share a little bit more about this piece around this digital engagement with patients. Sarah's shared a lot of great information about what goes into the setup, really understanding the sites, the investigators, and the cultural sensitivities. But what happens when you are up and running and now you're looking for that patient engagement? Something that we've really found very effective as we've worked in Latin America is this direct to patient outreach through some of these digital channels. And so, particularly as we have engaged on different social media platforms, we have seen that there's this massive user base across the region, and we can really highly target our advertising based off of locations or language or even some of those interests. And so, at Patient Wing, very similar to what Sarah and her team are doing, we really want to be empowering patients and their loved ones and those involved in clinical research to better understand those opportunities that are available to them. And so, what we have done and found successful is utilizing EC approved material. We can help to create awareness for these clinical study opportunities and then direct patients to a localized study page where they can read more about the study and then submit pre-screen questionnaire answers to determine their initial eligibility. Sarah then also mentioned the importance of PAG, so those patient advocacy groups. And so in parallel, working with those organizations, even if they aren't formalized or they don't have that nonprofit status, can also be a very powerful tool to get that information directly into the hands of individuals who are looking for more options. And so whether they are sharing that information via a WhatsApp group or even, on their own social media feeds, that is a way to directly share and bring awareness to those studies overall. So I think in partnership, as Sarah mentioned, these approaches are really creating more of this patient-centric model that meets people where they already are and then ultimately helps to support clinical trial success.
Great. Mhm.
So with that, we will open it up to our Q&A section. If you have questions for Sarah, go ahead and navigate to that Q&A button. You can put your question in. I'll go ahead and read that out so that the entire team can hear, and then would love to answer any of those questions that you all have. And Sarah, maybe while people are putting their questions in the chat, I was thinking about this as you were speaking. You mentioned, of course, a lot of that cultural adaptation that goes into the ways that, we either create materials for patients or share that out. I was wondering if you could share a few more of those examples, just to give, attendees a better understanding of why that is so critical. You talked about grapefruit, which I thought was really great, but any other examples that can help illustrate this a little bit more?
Well, I mean, if you look at the history of Latin America, it was conquered by Spain and Portugal, respectively. Portugal doing Brazil and Spain doing the rest of the world. And so it's been a conquered region. I mean, not unlike the United States, but just a little bit different, and a super Catholic region. And so I think there's a lot of oppression that has happened in the culture over time. Like we're talking a couple hundred years ish. So as a result, the family structure is really still very, very strong in the region. And therefore, the relationships are really, really important. And I think it just rolls out into the whole doctor-patient relationship. It becomes family. It becomes, your key relationship that you may have with a physician and or patient caregivers and or PAG groups. And so I think that's the history of where it comes from. And it means that you just need to be sensitive to slow down, take your time, meet people where they're at, as you mentioned earlier, get that coffee with them and get to know them a little more than just on a very high professional basis. I would say that it's different than the United States in that way, although we have a huge Latino population that's changing our culture in the United States as well, in a good way, probably. But that, I think, is the key of why the culture is so important, because relationships really, really, really matter there. They really are important.
Awesome. Okay, we have another question. This individual asked, you mentioned some of the advocacy groups are more informal. How did you find these groups?
Ooh, that's a good question. You know, you start with one and then you go from another. So in this particular case, there was a patient that had come to the National Institutes of Health, or rather the National Pediatric Institute in Mexico, and it was for a pediatric trial. And we basically asked that patient, do you know any other moms or groups or whatever? And so from there it grew, because that mom was very keen on getting her son. She knew about it. I don't know. I don't remember how she knew about the trial, but really it was like, it's like the telephone game. You call up somebody and then, well, talk to Renee. Oh, Renee, well, talk to Sarah, you know. So that's really how it formed. And there's still out there. One of the challenges, like the United States, but differently, because now the internet has changed everything, is that some people are extremely isolated. I mean, we still are supporting a compassionate use program, patient use, what's it called? Anyway, compassionate use program, where we fly people in to get their dose down in Mexico City from way up north in Mexico City, in Mexico, because there's no way they can get the medication any other way. So the point is, it's really individualized. And again, this is more focused on rare disease, but it's one person at a time.
Awesome. Another question, in your experience, which LATAM countries have been the most difficult to operate in?
That's a great question. I say it's changed. It's changed. Right now, I would say Central America is the easiest because they have the fastest regulatory, but they don't have a huge population. So for early trials, like a phase 1 would be great in that region. On the other side, Brazil also has changed their regulatory laws, and it's much, much faster and much easier to get in, to get approved. It's about 3 months, which that used to be like 9, 12 months. So that's a really big plus, again, for early phase all the way through late phase trials. The most difficult, I would say, right now is probably Peru, because their social system is not very friendly to the clinical research space. So I would say Peru is most difficult. And Colombia also has an interesting panorama, in the sense their regulatory timelines are very long, because they want to make sure they can cover whatever it is that you're, bringing to the table if it gets approved. And so they're really great once you get approval, but you got to be able to sit a long time to get approval. So it just depends on the country. But I would say, and Argentina is really pretty good, but some of the other countries are just, you just don't know about them. Like Guatemala. Guatemala can be very good for sure. It also depends on the disease. Like vaccines is one thing, infectious disease is another. Like dengue, it's a great place for dengue. And rare diseases and oncology are very good spaces for that.
All right, great questions. Any other questions today? Okay, we'll give you all a little bit more time, but I do want to make sure that we share an upcoming event that Sarah and her team are running. Sarah, do you want to talk a little bit about Rare Diem?
Sure, sure. So the name Rare Diem comes from the Carpe Diem, which is seize the day. Rare Diem stands for Rare Diseases in Emerging Markets. And starting in Latin America, our goal is to really bridge the gaps in rare diseases and creating awareness. What are the treatment options for people in the space? And of course, market access. So this will be a free virtual summit on Thursday, June 12th from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. You have to register down there. And we have some great speakers. We have a couple biotechs. We have some great vendors that are going to be there. And then we have a lot of sites. They're going to talk about their experience, the trust factor, the data factor. So I think it'll be a really interesting and a networking time, a nice virtual. And people say, why'd you do it virtual? We did it virtual so you could really be from anywhere and attend, because there are, as I said, over 20 countries. So we do want Latin American countries to come, US, Europe, anybody can come. It will be in English, and we'll have simultaneous translation of Spanish and Portuguese.
Okay, fabulous. Very excited about that as well. I think we may have one more question here.
Great.
Okay, question we have here. Can you talk about the fact that many LATAM countries are disadvantaged and can't afford medication for patients. Many players don't want to financially support incentives because they will not be able to sell their products, leaving many patients unsupported. Any
That's a
thoughts on
great
that?
point. Yeah, yeah. I was in a Congress in that last year conference. We talked about this, especially rare. We know that's a big deal. The point is, the companies that are coming into Latin America understand that. They for sure. So if you look at the globe, 20% of most products, most treatments are paid for in the US and Europe. That's 20% of the world. So that means 80% of the market is not being really tapped into. So what you have to ask yourself if you're the biotech or the pharma is it worth coming to Latin America to do that market access? From a patient perspective, products would eventually get approved by a government, and most of the time the governments are the ones who are paying for it. So there's two perspectives. One is if you're sitting as a sponsor, you need to understand that everything is negotiable. And if you have a strong team that can negotiate pricing, why wouldn't you access Brazil, the sixth largest health market in the whole world? Why wouldn't you? Or why wouldn't you go to Mexico that has 130 million people right next door to the United States? So that's one point. From the patient perspective, usually in clinical trials, if you're in a clinical trial as a patient, it is a requirement that the patient would get that medication, that treatment post-trial for X time, depending on the country. So there is an opportunity to get a treatment while things are getting approved. And that's all the more reason to be part of a patient advocacy group, to get into your senator's office and say, this is important. If you think about the cost of medication versus the ripple effect of not having a treatment, having to go to a cardiologist, neurologist, oncologist, you name it, there's a real cost burden to the system. And so it is complex, but there is a really big opportunity as well. I don't know if that answered their question.
No, great. Okay, well, as a reminder, today's webinar will be or was recorded, so we will send this out to everyone post finishing up today. Thank you so much all for the questions. You recommend that you sign up for the Rare Diem event coming up on Thursday, June 12th. It'll be a really great event, lots of good networking opportunities overall. But with that, we can go ahead and wrap up for today. Sarah, thank you again so much for sharing your insights, for sharing your passion for Latin America and the people there. It's been such a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you, Renee. You guys did a great job. Parabéns for this wonderful webinar. Felicidades. And we really appreciate your time as well today.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Bye.
Bye.
Ciao, ciao.